The people who underestimate you are usually the ones who cannot survive without you. That was the thought echoing through my mind as I stood on the sidewalk beneath the towering glass headquarters of Hayes Global Holdings, clutching a plain cardboard box filled with everything that remained of my career. The rain had started only minutes earlier, soaking my white dress shirt as employees hurried past without meeting my eyes. Above the entrance, a massive digital billboard proudly displayed the company's newest advertising campaign, celebrating another record-breaking quarter. I recognized every strategy behind that success because I had created most of them. Yet not a single person walking through those revolving doors would ever know. To them, I was simply another Omega carrying a box after being dismissed. The security guard gave me an apologetic nod before returning to his post. Even he looked more uncomfortable than I felt. Strangely, I was not angry. Not anymore. I was exhausted. For 3 years, I had worked late into countless nights, solving problems before they reached the executive floor, rescuing negotiations that should have failed, and quietly building systems that saved the company millions of dollars. Every report carried someone else's signature. Every successful presentation belonged to another department head. Every promotion somehow stopped one desk before reaching mine. I convinced myself that hard work would eventually speak louder than politics. I was wrong. This morning, I finally learned what my value truly meant to the people at the top. The emergency executive meeting had begun like every other Monday. Department leaders filled the conference room while I stood near the back, organizing financial projections that would shape the company's next expansion. Then Alpha Chief Executive Officer Alexander Hayes entered. His reputation alone could silence an entire boardroom. Confident, composed, and respected throughout the business world, he rarely wasted words. When he did speak, everyone listened. I admired him once. I believed he represented everything a great leader should become. That illusion lasted exactly 5 minutes. After reviewing disappointing numbers from a division I had repeatedly warned needed immediate attention, Alexander looked across the room with visible frustration. His eyes stopped on me. "This is exactly why I refuse to place critical operations in the hands of Omegas," he said in a calm voice that somehow felt colder than shouting. "Omegas are useless." The room became painfully quiet. No one challenged him. No one defended me. Several executives simply lowered their eyes while others pretended to study their tablets. Alexander continued as though he were discussing quarterly expenses instead of another human being. "Human Resources has prepared the paperwork. Ethan Brooks, your position has been eliminated effective immediately." Eliminated. Such a clean word for destroying years of dedication. I gathered my belongings without arguing because I realized something in that moment. Nothing I said would matter to people who had already decided what I was worth. As the elevator carried me toward the lobby, I glanced one final time at my employee identification badge before placing it inside the box. The doors opened. The rain welcomed me into a future I had never planned. I took one slow step onto the sidewalk and promised myself something I had never been brave enough to believe before. I would never beg anyone to recognize my value again. One day, they would discover it on their own, and by then, I would already be too far away to turn back. The hardest part about losing everything was discovering how quiet the world became afterward. The next morning, I woke up in my small apartment before sunrise out of habit, only to realize there was nowhere I needed to be. My phone remained silent. No emails marked urgent. No calendar reminders. No messages asking me to fix another crisis before anyone else noticed it. For the first time in years, the company that had consumed nearly every hour of my life continued operating without expecting anything from me. I made myself a simple breakfast, opened my laptop, and updated my resume without mentioning half of what I had actually accomplished. Most of my best work had been protected by confidentiality agreements or credited to senior executives, leaving me with a document that barely reflected my experience. It almost felt ironic. I had helped build one of the fastest-growing corporations in the country, yet on paper, I looked completely average. 3 days passed before I received my first interview invitation. It was not from another corporate giant. Instead, it came from a small technology startup called Horizon Dynamics, a company with fewer than 50 employees occupying a renovated warehouse on the edge of downtown. Their annual revenue was a tiny fraction of what Hayes Global Holdings earned in a single quarter, but something about the honesty in their message caught my attention. They did not promise prestige. They promised the opportunity to build something meaningful. I almost declined, convinced they would never be able to afford someone with my background. Then I laughed at myself. Pride had already cost me enough. When I arrived, nobody glanced at my Omega identification with judgment. The receptionist welcomed me with a genuine smile before introducing me to the founder, Olivia Carter, a beta whose rolled-up sleeves and tired eyes suggested she spent more time solving problems than attending meetings. Instead of asking why I had been dismissed, she asked a different question. If you could fix one thing in any struggling company, where would you start? I answered without rehearsing. I would start by listening to the people whose names never appear on the executive floor, because they usually know the problems long before leadership does. Olivia leaned back in her chair and smiled for the first time during the interview. She slid a thick folder across the table containing financial statements, customer feedback, and operational reports. Then tell me what we are missing. I spent the next hour reading every page carefully. By the time I finished, I had identified several patterns that were quietly draining the company's growth. None of the issues were impossible to solve. They simply required someone willing to connect details everyone else had treated as unrelated. Olivia listened without interrupting as I explained my observations. When I finally stopped, she folded her hands and asked one final question. How soon can you start? I blinked in surprise. You have not even checked my references. She smiled again. People can borrow impressive references. They cannot borrow the way they think. I accepted the offer before I could overthink it. The salary was lower than what I had earned before, the office was smaller, and the resources were limited, but as I walked through the building that afternoon, something felt different. Nobody cared whether I was an Omega. They cared whether I could help. For the first time since leaving Hayes Global Holdings, I realized that perhaps losing the career I thought I wanted had quietly placed me on the path toward the life I was actually meant to build. 3 months later, Horizon Dynamics no longer looked like the struggling startup I had walked into on my first day. The atmosphere inside the office had changed from quiet uncertainty to focused determination, and every small victory reminded us that progress rarely arrived through luck alone. Instead of chasing every opportunity, we concentrated on solving the right problems. We simplified complicated workflows, improved communication between departments, and rebuilt customer relationships one conversation at a time. I never asked for recognition, and Olivia never forced me into the spotlight. She simply trusted my judgment whenever difficult decisions appeared. That trust became more valuable than any executive title I had ever held. As new clients began signing long-term contracts, the company hired additional employees almost every month. People often congratulated Olivia for her leadership, and she always responded by thanking the entire team. Unlike my previous workplace, success here belonged to everyone who helped create it. Even so, I quietly noticed that many of the ideas driving our rapid growth felt strangely familiar. They were the same principles I had once proposed at Hayes Global Holdings before they had been ignored, delayed, or presented under someone else's name. The difference was simple. Here, people actually listened before making assumptions. One Tuesday morning, Olivia invited me into her office with an excited expression I had never seen before. She placed a business magazine on the desk and pointed toward a headline announcing Horizon Dynamics as one of the fastest-growing technology companies in the region. I smiled politely, but another article on the following page immediately caught my attention. Hayes Global Holdings had reported its second disappointing quarter in a row. Analysts described unexpected client losses, delayed product launches, and declining investor confidence. The article suggested the company had become slow to respond to changing market conditions, something that had never happened while I worked there. I closed the magazine without saying a word. I felt no satisfaction in their struggles. If anything, I felt disappointed that so many talented employees were now paying the price for decisions made at the top. Later that afternoon, our sales director rushed into the conference room carrying a tablet. "You are not going to believe this," he said with a grin. "Hayes Global just lost the Westbridge account." The room fell silent. Westbridge had once been one of the corporation's largest and most loyal business partners. Losing them was not just a financial setback. It was a warning to the entire market. Olivia looked toward me, but wisely avoided asking what I was thinking. She already knew enough about my past to understand why I remained quiet whenever my former employer entered the conversation. Instead, She shifted everyone's attention back to our own goals. "We are not here to celebrate another company's problems," she said calmly. "We are here to earn our own future." Her words reminded me exactly why I had chosen Horizon Dynamics. We competed through innovation, not arrogance. As the meeting ended, my email notification chimed softly. The sender's address belonged to a consulting firm representing several Fortune 500 companies. They wanted to schedule a private discussion regarding strategic partnerships after hearing about my recent work. I stared at the screen for several seconds before closing the message. Somehow, the world had begun noticing the value that had remained invisible for years. At that exact moment, several miles away inside the executive offices of Hayes Global Holdings, Alexander Hayes was reportedly demanding answers from every department after another major contract had unexpectedly collapsed. Neither of us realized that our paths, which had seemed permanently separated on the rainy afternoon I left that building carrying a cardboard box, were already beginning to move toward the same destination once again. Success has a strange way of revealing who truly built it after the applause disappears. 6 months after I joined Horizon Dynamics, our office had expanded into the floor above us. Our client list had doubled, and investors who once ignored us were now requesting meetings weeks in advance. Every achievement was the result of teamwork, yet I could not ignore the growing pattern hidden beneath the headlines. Every challenge our competitors struggled to overcome had been a challenge I had already solved years earlier. Horizon was not succeeding because we were lucky. We were succeeding because someone had finally given good ideas the chance to breathe. One Friday morning, Olivia invited me into the conference room before everyone else arrived. Several folders covered the large table, each labeled with the name of a major corporation interested in forming strategic partnerships with Horizon Dynamics. "You earned this," she said as she handed me the list. "Companies are not asking for me anymore. They are asking for the strategist behind our growth." I looked through the names until one stopped me cold. Hayes Global Holdings. They had requested a confidential exploratory meeting regarding operational consulting. I read the page twice, wondering whether someone had made a mistake. Olivia noticed my expression immediately. "I can refuse the meeting if you want," she said gently. I shook my head. "No, business should never become personal." The words sounded confident, but my heartbeat betrayed me. Before we could discuss it further, our finance director entered with unexpected news. "Hayes Global just released another earnings report," he said. "Their stock dropped again this morning after investors questioned leadership decisions." He placed several market summaries on the table. Revenue had declined for a third consecutive quarter. 2 senior executives had resigned. 3 major clients had transferred their contracts elsewhere. Analysts could not explain why a company that had dominated the industry only a year earlier now seemed unable to adapt. I quietly understood something they did not. The systems keeping that company stable had never been self-sustaining. They had depended on countless invisible corrections, preventative planning, and difficult conversations that happened long before problems reached the executive floor. After I left, those invisible safeguards disappeared one by one. Later that afternoon, I attended a virtual industry conference where executives discussed future technology trends. Near the end of the event, one presenter displayed a case study comparing Horizon Dynamics with Hayes Global Holdings. The audience reacted with surprise as charts showed our company climbing while theirs continued slipping. Nobody mentioned my name, yet I recognized every strategy highlighted on the screen. They had once been dismissed as unnecessary. Now they were being praised as the blueprint for sustainable growth. When the conference ended, my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. I almost ignored it before answering. "Mr. Brooks?" a calm voice asked. "My name is Rebecca Collins. I serve on the board of directors at Hayes Global Holdings. We would like to invite you to a private meeting next week regarding a potential consulting opportunity." I remained silent for several seconds. Rebecca continued carefully. "There are certain developments that require a fresh perspective." I thanked her politely and promised to consider the invitation before ending the call. As I placed my phone on the desk, Olivia walked into my office carrying 2 cups of coffee. She studied my face before asking only one question. "They finally realized what they lost, did they not?" I looked through the office window at the growing Horizon team working together with quiet confidence. Then I slowly nodded. Somewhere inside the headquarters I had once called home, people were no longer searching for a replacement. they were searching for. The person they had never truly understood until he was gone. People rarely discover the truth because they choose to look for it. They discover it because they run out of excuses. The invitation from Hayes Global Holdings sat unopened on my desk for 2 days before I finally agreed to the meeting. I did not accept because I wanted to return. I accepted because unanswered questions had a way of following people much longer than difficult conversations. Olivia supported my decision without hesitation. "Go as yourself," she told me before I left. "You do not owe anyone an apology for succeeding." Those words stayed with me during the drive across the city toward the same glass tower I had walked away from months earlier carrying a cardboard box. The building looked exactly the same from the outside, but the energy inside felt completely different. The reception area was quieter, employees spoke in lowered voices, and the confidence that had once defined the company had been replaced by visible tension. A board assistant greeted me politely and escorted me to a private conference room instead of the executive floor where I had once worked behind the scenes. A few minutes later, 3 members of the board of directors entered, including Rebecca Collins. Surprisingly, Alexander Hayes was not with them. Rebecca thanked me for coming before sliding several thick binders across the polished table. "Before we discuss anything else," she said, "we believe you deserve to see these." Inside were internal audit reports completed after several disappointing quarters. As I turned each page, a familiar pattern emerged. Nearly every successful initiative from the past 3 years had been traced back to project drafts, operational recommendations, or risk assessments carrying my employee identification number before someone else's approval had been added to the final version. Customer retention strategies, cost reduction plans, expansion forecasts, emergency response procedures, and even the framework behind the company's most profitable product launch all began with documents I had written. The auditors had reconstructed the timeline by reviewing archived files, revision histories, and internal communication records. What had once looked like ordinary administrative support had quietly formed the foundation beneath the company's greatest achievements. Rebecca watched my expression carefully before speaking again. "We honestly did not realize how much of this originated with you until our investigation." I closed the final binder without saying anything. Recognition that arrived after everything had fallen apart carried very little satisfaction. Another board member lowered his eyes. "We spent months searching for the reason our decision-making suddenly became inconsistent. We assumed the market had changed. We blamed competitors. We blamed the economy. We even blamed each other." He paused before taking a slow breath. "The truth was much simpler. We stopped listening to the person who had been preventing mistakes before anyone else noticed them." At that moment, the conference room door opened quietly. Alexander stepped inside wearing the same tailored suit and calm expression I remembered, yet something about him had changed. The confidence that once filled every room no longer came from certainty. It came from someone carrying the weight of difficult truths. His eyes met mine for the first time since the day I was dismissed. Neither of us spoke immediately. The silence between us lasted only a few seconds, but it carried the distance of an entire year. Finally, Alexander looked at the binders spread across the table before returning his gaze to me. His voice was calm, but there was no trace of pride left in it. "I spent months trying to understand why everything began collapsing after you left," he said quietly. "Now I finally know that I was never losing a position." He paused, taking responsibility for every word that followed. "I was losing the person who had been holding the company together all along." Regret sounds very different when it comes from someone who has finally run out of people to blame. Alexander remained standing across the conference table, his eyes never leaving mine as silence settled over the room. Months earlier, he had dismissed me with complete certainty. Now, for the first time since we had met, he looked like a man questioning every decision that had brought him here. I folded my hands calmly and looked back at him. "Knowing the truth does not change what happened," I said quietly. No one interrupted. Even the members of the board of directors understood this conversation no longer belonged to the company. It belonged to 2 people whose lives had been permanently altered by a single decision. Alexander gave a slow nod. "I know," he answered. "That is why I am not asking you to pretend it never happened." He took a seat across from me instead of standing at the head of the table as he once always had. It was a small gesture, but one that spoke louder than any prepared statement. "After you left," he continued, I believed we only needed to replace an employee. We hired experienced consultants, promoted department managers, and invested millions of dollars into new systems. None of it worked. Every solution fixed one problem while creating two more. Rebecca quietly placed another folder on the table. This one contained customer satisfaction reports, employee retention data, and internal performance reviews collected over the previous year. Every chart pointed in the same direction. Trust inside the company had steadily declined. Talented employees had stopped sharing new ideas. Managers had become afraid of making independent decisions. Departments competed instead of cooperating. I recognized the pattern immediately because I had spent years preventing exactly this kind of culture from taking root. Companies do not collapse because of one mistake, I said after reading several pages. They collapse because people stop listening before the mistakes become visible. Alexander lowered his eyes. You warned me more than once. I remembered every report that had disappeared without discussion, every recommendation delayed until it became a crisis, and every meeting where my voice had been politely acknowledged before being ignored. Back then, I believed I simply needed to work harder. Now I understood the problem had never been effort. It had been respect. Alexander slowly reached into his briefcase and removed a thin blue notebook. I recognized it. Immediately. It was the planning journal I had accidentally left in my office on the day I was dismissed. He carefully placed it in front of me. I found this after your departure, he admitted. At first I intended to return it through human resources. Then I started reading your project outlines. He paused before continuing. Every page contained plans for problems we had not encountered yet. When those problems eventually appeared exactly as you predicted, I realized how little I had understood the person sitting only a few yards away from me every day. I gently picked up the notebook and ran my fingers across its familiar cover. It was never meant to prove my value. It was simply a habit I had developed to stay organized. Yet somehow it had become the evidence that finally opened everyone's eyes. Alexander took a slow breath before speaking again. I cannot undo the words I said. I cannot erase the way I judged you. But I also cannot continue pretending that pride matters more than truth. His voice remained steady, but every word carried genuine humility. I am asking you for one opportunity. Not to return as my employee, and not because the company needs saving. I am asking because I want to earn the chance to rebuild the trust that I destroyed, even if it takes far longer than losing it ever did. Some opportunities arrive disguised as forgiveness, but the hardest decision is knowing whether accepting them means moving forward or simply walking backward. I looked at Alexander for a long moment before closing the blue notebook and sliding it back across the table. You do not need to earn my trust by giving me another job, I said calmly. You earn trust by becoming someone who would never make the same mistake again. The room remained silent as my words settled over everyone present. Alexander nodded without hesitation. That is fair, he replied. I expected nothing less. There was no argument, no attempt to defend the past, and no excuse hidden behind pressure or circumstances. For the first time since I had known him, he accepted responsibility without asking anyone else to share the burden. Rebecca broke the silence by explaining that the board had already begun restructuring the company's leadership process. Executive decisions would require broader consultation, anonymous employee feedback would become part of quarterly evaluations, and every department would have direct access to present concerns before they developed into larger problems. It was the kind of culture I had spent years quietly advocating for, yet hearing those changes now brought me a strange sense of peace rather than satisfaction. They were finally learning the lesson, even if it had come at an enormous cost. As the meeting concluded, Alexander asked if we could speak privately for a few minutes. Rebecca and the other directors respectfully left the conference room, closing the door behind them. We sat across from each other once again, but this time there were no reports, no financial charts, and no audience waiting for the outcome. It was simply two people speaking honestly. I have replayed that morning in my mind more times than I can count, Alexander admitted. Not because I lost business afterward, but because I realized I stopped seeing individuals and started seeing labels. I convinced myself I was making objective decisions when I was actually allowing assumptions to replace judgment. I appreciated the honesty, yet I also knew regret alone could never rewrite history. People remember how they were treated long after they forget the exact words, I answered quietly. The day I left this building, I stopped believing that my work would ever matter more than my identity. Alexander lowered his gaze for a brief moment before looking back at me. Then I failed as a leader. There was no hesitation in his voice. No pride protecting his ego. Only acceptance. Before I could respond, my phone vibrated on the table. It was Olivia. I answered immediately. "How did it go?" she asked with genuine concern. I smiled without realizing it. "Better than I expected." She laughed softly. "Good. Because I have news of my own. The Westbridge executives just accepted our long-term partnership proposal. They specifically requested that you lead the strategic planning team." I thanked her and ended the call before slipping my phone back into my pocket. Alexander had heard enough to understand what had happened. Instead of disappointment, an almost relieved smile crossed his face. "Congratulations," he said sincerely. "You built something remarkable." I stood and extended my hand. After a brief pause, Alexander accepted it. The handshake felt completely different from every interaction we had shared in the past. There was no hierarchy between us anymore, no title carrying greater weight than character. "I am not coming back," I said with quiet certainty. "My future is already waiting somewhere else." Alexander released my hand and nodded. "I know." As I walked toward the conference room door, he spoke one final sentence that stopped me for just a moment. "Even if you never return, I hope one day I become the kind of leader who would have deserved the employee I was too blind to appreciate." Without turning around, I smiled faintly before continuing toward the elevator, knowing that sometimes the greatest victory was not proving someone wrong, but proving to yourself that you had already outgrown the place that once underestimated you. Real change begins the moment someone chooses to protect others from the same pain they once caused. 2 weeks after my meeting at Hayes Global Holdings, the business world was stunned by an announcement that dominated financial news across the country. The company was not unveiling a revolutionary product or celebrating record profits. Instead, the board of directors held a public leadership forum where Alexander stood before shareholders, employees, and industry reporters to address the company's future. I watched the live broadcast from the conference room at Horizon Dynamics alongside Olivia and several members of our executive team. No one spoke as Alexander walked onto the stage. The confident executive who had once controlled every room with absolute certainty now carried himself differently. His confidence remained, but it was no longer built on believing he was always right. It came from accepting responsibility for being wrong. After thanking everyone for attending, he surprised the audience by setting aside his prepared speech. "Before discussing our plans for rebuilding this company," he began, "I need to acknowledge why rebuilding became necessary in the first place." Reporters immediately started taking notes. Shareholders exchanged confused glances. Alexander continued without hesitation. "For too long, I believed strong leadership meant having all the answers. I measured people by assumptions instead of contributions, titles instead of talent, and expectations instead of character. Those decisions cost this company far more than financial losses. They damaged trust." The room became completely silent. He never mentioned my name, and I realized he was intentionally protecting my privacy instead of using my story to improve his own reputation. Instead, he focused entirely on the lessons he had learned. He announced a series of reforms that would permanently reshape the company's culture, including transparent promotion standards, anonymous innovation reviews to eliminate personal bias, expanded leadership training, and employee advisory councils that reported directly to the board. Every proposal reflected one simple principle that had been missing for years. Every voice deserved to be heard before it was judged. Olivia smiled quietly beside me. "He is finally leading," she said. I understood exactly what she meant. Leadership was not about standing in front of people when everything was going well. It was about standing in front of them when admitting failure carried the greatest personal cost. Over the following months, industry analysts began noticing gradual improvements inside Hayes Global Holdings. Employee turnover slowed. Client confidence stabilized. Internal surveys reported higher morale. The company still faced enormous challenges, but for the first time, recovery appeared possible because its foundation had begun changing instead of merely its strategy. Meanwhile, Horizon Dynamics continued expanding beyond anything we had imagined. The Westbridge partnership opened doors to national contracts, and our team grew into hundreds of talented professionals working together across multiple offices. Olivia promoted me to Chief Strategy Officer, insisting the title reflected responsibilities I had already been carrying for months. Unlike my previous promotion opportunities, this one arrived without politics or hidden conditions. It arrived because someone believed in my work before asking for proof that I deserved the chance. One afternoon, an invitation arrived for an annual leadership summit bringing together executives from the country's largest corporations. Horizon Dynamics and Hayes Global Holdings had both been selected to participate in a panel discussing the future of organizational leadership. As I read the event schedule, I noticed one familiar name listed beside mine: Alexander Hayes. This time, we would not meet as a chief executive officer and a dismissed employee. We would meet as equals invited to share what success truly required. I quietly folded the invitation and smiled, realizing that life had arranged a second meeting neither of us could have imagined on the rainy afternoon when I walked away believing our story had already reached its end. The greatest success in life is not proving the people who doubted you were wrong. It is becoming the person who no longer needs their approval. The National Leadership Summit filled one of the largest convention centers in the country, bringing together executives, entrepreneurs, investors, and business students eager to hear how successful organizations adapted to an ever-changing world. As I stood backstage preparing for the panel discussion, I realized how dramatically my life had changed since the rainy afternoon when I walked out of Hayes Global Holdings carrying a simple cardboard box. Back then, I believed I had lost my future. Now I understood I had only lost the place that was never meant to define it. When my name was announced, I walked onto the stage beside Olivia, Alexander, and several respected industry leaders. The audience welcomed us with warm applause before the moderator opened the discussion with a simple question: what is the most important lesson your career has taught you? The answers varied from innovation to resilience and strategic planning. When the microphone reached Alexander, the room grew noticeably quieter. He smiled briefly before answering with complete honesty. Never underestimate someone simply because they do not fit the expectations you created in your own mind. Leadership begins the moment you choose to see people for their contributions instead of your assumptions. His words carried no bitterness and no attempt to rewrite history. They reflected someone who had genuinely changed. When my turn arrived, I looked across the audience and saw hundreds of faces waiting for an answer. I learned that your value does not disappear because someone fails to recognize it, I said calmly. Sometimes the right environment reveals strengths that the wrong environment could never appreciate. Never let another person's opinion become the limit of your own future. The audience responded with sustained applause, but the moment that stayed with me happened after the panel ended. A young Omega approached me with nervous determination and introduced himself as an intern attending his first professional conference. He admitted that he often questioned whether he truly belonged in the corporate world because of the stereotypes he constantly encountered. I smiled and told him something I wish someone had told me years earlier. You do not need to spend your life convincing everyone of your worth. Spend your life becoming so capable that the right people recognize it without being asked. His relieved smile reminded me that every difficult experience carries the possibility of helping someone else avoid the same pain. As the conference came to a close, Alexander found me near the exit overlooking the city skyline. He extended his hand once more, but this time it was not as an apology. It was as a colleague who respected another professional. Thank you, he said sincerely. Not for returning today, but for showing me what real leadership looks like. I accepted the handshake with a quiet smile. We both learned something, I replied. That is what matters. We walked out of the convention center in different directions, each returning to the future we had chosen rather than the past we could never change. Horizon Dynamics continued growing into one of the most respected companies in the industry because its culture valued every voice. Hayes Global Holdings slowly rebuilt its reputation by proving that humility could become the foundation of lasting success. Looking back, I realized the day I lost my job was never the end of my story. It was simply the moment I stopped asking for permission to believe in myself. And that single decision changed not only my future, but the future of everyone willing to discover that respect, integrity, and character will always outlast prejudice, pride, and fear.